All right, let's try this again. Welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple book by book, chapter by chapter, excuse me, and verse by verse study through the entire Bible. We are in Matthew chapter 24, and I'm going to attempt to get through chapters 25. Jesus is teaching on eschatology, and more pointedly, his second coming. And then what he will do uh, with when he comes, and that's what we're getting a glimpse. Now, in order to understand context here, it's important to understand that Jesus is speaking from a Jewish perspective. That he is Matthew presents him as the Jewish Messiah, and this is why, as we are reading um, all of Matthew, but the excuse me, the end times that Jesus is talking about, the end times, they are coming from how God deals with Israel. So you shouldn't apply other aspects. For example, Jesus is not talking about the Christian church in this chapter. The rapture is not discussed in chapters 24 and 25. In fact, the idea of the rapture is something really Jesus talks about it in John chapter 14. You don't understand it until Paul talks about it in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. But he's not talking about it here in Matthew chapter 24. And so you have to look at it from a Jewish perspective to understand what Jesus is saying in this chapter. So as we advance on, of course, now we are, and we got a glimpse of this, and we read Revelations chapter 19, where we saw Jesus return, and then it's important, we saw the armies of the beast gather to fight against Jesus. Now, if you also kind of go back and remember, if you go back in the past several sessions in Zechariah chapter 14, we get another vivid picture of when Jesus comes. His feet sets down on the Mount of Olives. In fact, he says, I will gather all the nations at the valley of Jehoshaphat. And the Bible says that he goes out and he fights as he fought in the day of battle. And then you have to understand that, again, from a Jewish perspective. So now we're in verse 45 when Jesus says that, let me kind of just go back. In verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, then he says, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the people will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of glory with power and great glory. He will send out his angels with a loud trumpet. They will gather his elect, and that elect means Israel here, not the church. He will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. And then he gets in verse 32, learn the parable of the fig tree. Now he's talking about the timing. How will we know when Jesus is going to come? How will we know this? What are the signs we can look at? Well, he gave us the signs, the abomination that makes desolation. And then, of course, every eye will see him. So as you get to verse 36, concerning the day and the hour, no one knows, but you can look at the times, how evil they will be. By the way, this time when he says, as in the days of Noah, this is specifically during the age or the time, during the beast, because that's when pure evil, sin will be purely manifested in the hearts of all of the sinful people who rejects the gospel of God. The Bible tells us that they will be deceived. They will worship the dragon who gives the beast his power. They will worship the beast. And so again, total sin. So then you see the coming of the Son of Man. And then the admonishment here is to be ready. Now, who is he talking to again? He's talking to Israel. So in other words, he's not talking to the church. And I read this before, because if you say, look at this, verse 44, this is why you also must be ready, because the Son of Man comes at an hour you do not expect. He's talking to Israel here. He's not talking to the church. He doesn't tell the church, you have to be ready. Because then how do you be ready? But as we move on now, you're going to see he's going to tell us how Israel is to be ready. So verse 45 says, who then is that faithful and sensible slave? And let me just stop again. Let me tell you why this is not talking about the church. Because the church, which is his body, are not slaves. Galatians and Romans, Galatians chapter 4 and Romans chapter 8 tells us that we are no longer slaves, but that we are sons of God. That's who God sees us as. Now, in service to the king, a lot of the Christian right apostles will refer to themselves as the bond slaves of Jesus Christ. And that's from the reference, the context of their being on this earth, serving God, Jesus in this earth. But, excuse me. But as far as who we are not slaves, we are sons of God. So then he says, who then is that faithful, sensible slave whom his master has put in charge of his household to give them the food at the proper time? Now this is, again, you go into Jeremiah, you see the rebuke that God gives the leaders of Israel, how they neglected, how they abuse God's people. You also see terminology that the vineyard is God's, the household of Israel. Okay, that's why I said, in order to really understand what Jesus is saying here, especially since we come from a non-Jewish perspective, then you have to understand the Old Testament, how God communicated to Israel in the writings of the prophets. So the leaders of Israel were tasked to feed God's people. He said, verse 46, he says, that slave whose master find him working when he comes will be rewarded. So when Jesus comes, who is he going to first judge? Israel. He says, I assure you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that wicked slave say in his heart, my master is delayed, and he starts to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with drunkards, the slave master will come on a day he does not expect, and at our church. In other words, is our salvation based upon what we do, the tasks that Jesus gives us to do. And again, he's talking specifically here about the leaders of Israel and what they were supposed to do. Their job description, right, was to take care of God's flock, to feed them. Now, these masters, by the way, think about this. He's not describing people who are saved, right? He says, but if, verse 48 again, but if that wicked slave says in his heart, so he's not talking about the church, but if that wicked slave says in his heart, my master is delayed, and starts to beat his fellow slaves and to eat with drunkards. So that's not describing those who have been born again. All right. So the idea is that, again, they're abusing God's people. Now, verse 25 says, then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the groom. Now, this parable has a lot of debate, because who are the 10 virgins here, right? Who are the and some people, I don't know how you could really do this, and I guess you can do this if you're not understanding, again, the context from a Jewish perspective. So then he says the kingdom of heaven would be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the groom. So what Jesus now is talking about is a Jewish wedding. And back in these days, the Jewish weddings were quite elaborate in terms of their celebration. You had always different components to it. So you would have the groom kind of hanging out with his boys, and then the virgins, their job, their task was to make the bride ready, and then present the bride to the groom when he comes. That's what their job. And that's why it says 10 virgins. Now again, the kingdom of heaven refers to Israel here. He says, so the kingdom of heaven would be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the groom. Now again, if you understand the Jewish customs, you cannot say that this is the Christian church in any way. Because at the very least, don't a lot of people even think that the church is the bride of Christ? So if the church is the bride of Christ, how can they be these virgins whose task is to escort the to escort the bride to the groom? Okay? And just so we know, let me just show you this verse here in Psalm the 45th Psalm. And here's a good illustration of this. In colorful garments, let me start in verse 13. He says, in her chambers, the royal daughter is all glorious. Her clothing embroidered with gold. In colorful garments, she is led to the king. After her, the virgins, her companions, are brought to you. They are led in with gladness and rejoicing to enter the king's palace. I just kind of wanted to show you, because this really is one of the only verses I've seen like this, but that will compare close to when you think about the wedding perception here. So the 10 virgins here are referring to not the church, but again, those who are tasked to care for Israel. And let me also say this too. When the Bible speaks of the bride of Christ and the wedding, okay, there are two ways that it's mentioned, two aspects that it's mentioned. One aspect that is mentioned is in the New Testament, the church is referred to as how Jesus cares for the church, right? So the church, you can say how Jesus cares for the church. It's clear in the context that's an illustration because remember who we are the sons of God. The church is the body of Christ. That's who we are. Now, in teaching, Paul illustrates our relationship, one in relationship to Jesus, the church. I mean, Jesus as the Jesus being the head, and then Jesus, the church, being the one he cares for. Now, the other illustration that you find is in the book of Revelation, where in Revelation chapter 21 and chapter 22, the angel says to John, come and I'm going to show you the Lamb's bride. And then he showed them the holy city, the New Jerusalem. Okay? So either way, my point is that the virgins here cannot be the church because they are the ones who are tasked to present the bride, okay, when the groom comes. So then he says, then the kingdom of heaven is like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the groom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were sensible. When the foolish took their lamps, they didn't take olive oil with them, but the sensible ones took oil in their flask with their lamps. Since the groom was delayed, they all became drowsy and fell asleep. In other words, they were waiting for this bridal procession. The groom was to come through the town. He would stop, collect his bride, and then they would go into the wedding banquet. and the virgins were tasked to make sure that the bride was ready. That's why they had to have their lamps ready, trimmed and ready, that when the car came out, they would light them and escort the bride. That's what their task was. They were not the ones getting married. So in any illustration where the church is concerned, right, we would not be the virgins, because we would either be the ones getting married or getting married. So verse 6 said, in the middle of the night, there was a shout, here's the groom, come out to meet him. Then all those virgins got up, trimmed their lamps, but the foolish ones said to the sensible ones, give us some of your oil, because our lamps are going out. So if you're going to say this is a church, and what is the oil, and where did they go and get the oil? Okay. The sensible ones answered, no, there won't be enough for us and for you. Go instead to those who sell and buy oil for yourselves. Right? Well, who is selling? What is, again, so you have to, if you say that this is the church, then you would have to say, you would have to say that, okay, you would have to say, all right, what are we doing here? Anyway, you would have to say, all right, I'm kind of all over the place here. Everything is acting up here. But anyway, so let's get back to this. So the sensible ones who were ready, the foolish ones came and said, hey, give us some of your oil. But the sensible one says, we won't have enough. Go to the ones who sell the oil. So again, how would this be put in a Christian setting? So anyway, and when they had gone, verse 10, when they had gone to buy some, the groom arrived, and then those who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later, the rest of the virgins came and said to him, Master, open for us. But he replied, I assure you, I do not know you. Therefore, be alert, because you don't know either the day or the hour. So this is all about what? Israel being ready. Okay? And notice this, that again, this could not be the church, because he says, I don't know you. If you are truly saved, even if you believe you can lose your salvation, then Jesus could not say, I don't know you, since he do know you, because you were even saved, even though if you follow that belief that you can lose your salvation, Jesus would say, well, I know you, but you walked away, you laughed, right? So the point is that he never knew them. Verse 14 says, for it is just like a man going on a journey. He called his own slaves and turned over his possessions to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his own ability. And then he went on a journey. Immediately, the man who had received 5 talents went and put them to work and earned 5 more. In the same way, the man who with 2 earned 2 more. The man who had received 1 talent went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came to settle accounts with them. So again, he's not talking about Christians. So what accounts would we have to settle with the Lord? What money did the Lord give us? What talents did the Lord give us that we would have to settle accounts? And remember, specifically in this parable, he was saying that you were supposed to do something with this. You were supposed to earn more. Verse 20, the man who had received 5 talents approached and presented 5 more talents and said, Master, you gave me 5 talents. Look, I've earned 5 more talents. His master said, well done, good and faithful servant. You are faithful over a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Share in the master's joy. Then the man with 2 talents approached. He said, Master, you gave me 2 talents. Look, I've earned 2 more talents. His master said to him, well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful over a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Share your master's joy. So this is the reward for being a faithful servant. The man who had received 1 talent also approached and said, Master, I know you. You are a difficult man, reaping where you haven't sown and gathering where you haven't scattered seed. So I was afraid, went off and hid your talents in the ground. Look, you have what is yours. But his master replied to him, You evil, lazy slave! If you knew that I reap where I haven't sown and gathered where I haven't, I'm sorry, if if you had known that I reap where I haven't sown or gathered where I haven't scattered, then you should have deposited my money with the bankers, and when I return, I would have received my money back with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. To everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have more than enough. But from the one who does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. And throw that good-for-nothing slave into outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now again, remember, the setting here is how Israel leaders should be caring for God's people, or the people of Israel, in various different aspects. And they, in this case here, they did not do what the master had told them to do. And remember, the problem with this last one was he had no right to do nothing with his master's money. That's why he was rebuked and said, we should have at least put it in the bank and I would have had interest. You just did nothing. Why? Because you were evil and lazy. Now, verse 31 says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory. Now, this is kind of interesting because it gives us a glimpse to, remember Jesus, the setting here is Jesus coming. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all his angels with him, he will sit on his throne of glory, all nations. Now, get this. So now he talks about, he shifts and he says, now this is what's going to happen when Jesus comes. The King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, when he comes, remember, he's going to seize control of the earth. All nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another, just as a shepherd separates his sheep from the goats. He will put his sheep on the right and the goats on the left, and the king will say to those on his right, Come ye, you are blessed of my Father. Come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared from you from the foundation of the world. Now remember, he's talking about nations. He's talking about nations. Well, I was hungry and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, you took me in. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. Now, a lot of people distort this verse right here to say that this is in some way how Christians should act about taking in the poor and the naked, so forth and so on. And really what this parable is, and again, he's not saying not to do this, by the way, but what this parable really is about is how then the nations will care for Israel. Okay? That's what he's talking about right here. So he says, then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, or without clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? And the king will answer him, I assure you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did it for me. Okay? So that's when so those nations, again, and that's why too you will find that there are Christians that really advocate for the support of Israel based upon this scripture. And I agree with that too. Now, again, and that doesn't mean that whatever they do, that we should just ignore. So, okay. But, notice he said, especially in times when Israel was under attack by other nations, those that care I think it's a good illustration of that, those that care. So look at verse 41. Then he will also say to those on the left, depart from me, you who are cursed, into eternal fire prepared for the devil and the angels. Now note this, that eternal fire or hell was prepared for the devil, not for man. Originally, it wasn't prepared for man. When Adam sinned, he aligned himself with Satan. Okay, and that's when, as one scripture said, hell enlarged itself. Okay, he said, "For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, you did not take me in. I was naked, you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison, and you did not care for me." And they too will answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry, or thirsty, or a stranger, and without clothes, or sick, or in prison, and did not help you?" Then he will answer them, "I assure you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me either." And they will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. Now, so again, to understand this is not a general teaching to the world on charitable giving, okay? And what I'm saying is this parable is not. This parable specifically, chapters, going into chapter 24, 25, specifically is talking about when Jesus comes and sets up his kingdom, and as he settles account, and he judges the world, he judges Israel, he judges how the world treated Israel, he judges the nations. That's what that verse is for. And that's why he said, "I was naked, you did not care for me," talking about Israel, how people treated Israel in that last parable. So, all right, guys. I took a little time again just to kind of do a little more than I normally would do in this study here. Again, I am doing an in-depth study, an exhaustive study on end times on our Friday night Bible study. And the title of that is "The Rapture and the Second Coming Explained," or the difference between the rapture and the second coming. So if you want to get into that, tune in for the Friday night, which is tonight, later on, and we will be getting in a more exhaustive study with that. So, all right, guys, don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comments section below. All comments are welcome, and I'll see you in the next study.